Hey guys, welcome back to Reignited. Now we are again working on the twin charged Magnum project, and the goal for this episode is to have the vehicle running by the end of the episode. We'll see how that plays out. But the only way that can happen is if I stop yapping my gums and we get this engine back in the car. Let's get started. All right, we've got a short block here ready to be dropped back into the vehicle. You'll notice that I did reinstall the flex plate here, and also make sure that you do not forget your spacer plate that goes in between the engine and the transmission. Now this thing can be a real pain because it actually sits on these dowels right here, but if you jiggle it even a little bit, this spacer plate can actually fall off and be really irritating while you're actually trying to reinstall the engine. Now I've tried a variety of different ways to actually hold this thing in place. However, the best version actually came to me by way of commenters a number of months ago. A couple of people mentioned, hey, I just used some zip ties here at the corners to hold it in place until you get down in there, and as soon as you do, you clip the zip ties, you're good to go. It works fantastic, and I've done it that way ever since. If you go back and watch some of my earlier videos, you'll see that I generally will put the engine completely together before actually dropping it back into the vehicle, but I kind of switched up my style since then, and I prefer just dropping in the short block now and then putting on the heads afterwards. The reason for that is because even though there's a little bit less room in the engine bay to actually get these heads on, I think it makes a lot more sense as far as actually fitting the engine in there. These cars, these LX cars, the 300 Magnum, Challenger, Charger, they're a fairly tight engine bay, especially when you have the cylinder heads on, you have the exhaust manifolds on. It gets very tricky to actually slip it back between the rails. I've done it a ton. Clearly you can do it, but I've realized I just think it's easier with the short block, and you guys can tell from that clip right there, it took me less than 5 minutes to actually get that engine in and bolted up. Now we're gonna switch our focus over to installing the cylinder heads on the engine. Now you guys remember that we are installing a set of ARP head studs on this vehicle. Now if the head studs were already installed on the engine, we'd never be able to get the cylinder heads on and off inside the vehicle. So I'm basically going to slip these cylinder heads into place and then install the head studs after that. So we have a set of brand new head gaskets we're going to be installing. These are just stock MLS head gaskets here. I think they're very good quality, very high quality. I have no problem with using these particular gaskets. Another thing, on any sort of a Hemi engine, you'll want to install the cylinder heads with the exhaust manifolds already on the heads. Doing it after the fact is a tremendous difficulty, especially in these vehicles. They're very tight engine bays, like I mentioned. So install the exhaust manifold onto the cylinder head and install the whole thing as a unit. Same thing with taking it off. You want to just take it off with the cylinder, with the exhaust manifold on there. Now in my case, I'm just installing a set of my turbo manifolds that I made, and they're actually about the same size as the stock log manifolds are, so it doesn't present any extra difficulties. Now I have gotten the question a ton, can you install the cylinder heads with a set of long tube headers on them already? And I gotta be honest, I've never actually done it myself, but I think about that question a lot, and I look at the space that's available and how you actually install these things. I'm pretty sure it can be done. Pretty sure. Obviously, all the long tube headers are of different styles, but I honestly think that you can do it, and it just makes more sense than trying to fit it in after the fact to the vehicle. Like I said, super tight in there. But for right now, let's go ahead and get these turbo manifolds installed to our cylinder heads. All right, turbo manifolds are back onto the cylinder heads. Let's go ahead and get these things back onto the vehicle. This is where it really starts to become real. Once you get your cylinder heads on your engine, it starts to feel like it might actually run again someday. So it's a nice psychological thing moving forward. Now we're going to move on to installing our ARP head studs here. Now I got to admit, as expensive as these things are, they look really, really nice, and I think they're going to offer a lot of clamping force here. Now, one of the reasons I decided to make this upgrade, not only because I switched it to a 6.4 and a different camshaft, so I'm expecting to make more power than I was before, but one thing I didn't tell you guys was last time around when I originally got this thing running, again, stock blocks, stock cylinder head bolts, all of that, under a couple of pulls, it was spitting a little bit of water out of the overflow tank. So not exactly sure if it was pushing anything past the head gasket, but that's kind of what it felt like was happening. So This time around, I put a fair amount of money into this particular setup. I don't want to have any issues like that. I think these ARP head studs are going to be some nice insurance against having any sort of issues like that at all. Now, they do come with some pretty comprehensive instructions. It's very simple. Just read through the instructions. Make sure you're following the procedures as they recommend. You won't have any problems installing these things. Let's get those heads bolted down. Now, something I wanted to cover here is the installation of the push rods. I would say 90% of the time when people message me and say, hey, I did a cam and lifter job on this engine, or I did something where I had the cylinder heads off and I put it all back together, now the thing's stumbling, doesn't want to run right, and quits unless I'm staying on the gas. I would say 90% of the time it's because your push rods were not installed correctly. Now, there's a couple of different things you can do wrong here. One is that there's actually an opening next to the push rod opening here for the intake rockers, for the intake push rods, that you could actually slide it into that hole instead of the push rod hole, and therefore the push rod's not even actually actuating when you're running the engine. That is one issue, but by far more common than that is when you actually try to get the rocker arms back on, they don't actually get the ball end of the push rod fully seated into the rocker cup, and as soon as they start the engine, it pops out, pops free, and all of a sudden you're no longer actuating the intake valve on that cylinder. Now, the exhaust ones are very simple because you can actually see them and verify that they are fully seated. The intake ones are a little bit more tricky. They take a little bit more finesse, but you can verify that they are seated correctly before you put the valve cover back on and fire it up and then have a problem and have to take everything back apart again. So if I were to give you any tips whatsoever at all with reassembling your cylinder heads, it's make sure you are installing your push rods correctly. I'll go over a little bit more tips here as I start to install it. But remember that you have two different lengths of push rods. The long ones are going to be your exhaust push rods and the short ones are the intake. Now, I always install my exhaust rocker arms first, and that's simply because you can actually verify that they are in the correct position. It gets a little bit more difficult with the intake rocker on there, but you just kind of slip them all into place. Make sure you start the bolt threads by hand. And right off the bat here, you can verify that each one of these push rods is fully inserted into the rocker cup itself, and then you can start tightening down the bolts. So the exhaust rocker side isn't really the problem. A couple other things to note here is that you'll want to tighten these bolts down evenly. Now, your camshaft is going to be at whatever position it is. So notice that some of these push rods will be longer than the others. That is perfectly normal because they're at different stages of that stroke for that cylinder, right? So it's not a problem if your push rods are at different lengths here. Just go ahead and tighten these things down evenly until they are sucked fully down to the rocker stand, and we're going to tighten these bolts, both the exhaust and the intake side, to 16 foot-pounds. Also, I don't recommend using any sort of a power appliance here. I recommend doing it by hand. You can actually strip out the threads inside these rocker stands, and then you're in a real problem. All right, now for the intake rockers, it's easy to tell that these are them because they have an embossed eye on the actual rocker itself. So I for intake, obviously. Again, we just want to kind of place it in place. You can hand put the push rods in place. They're probably going to fall out after you do, but it's a good starting point. And again, try to actually get all of these bolts at least started in the rocker stand before we move forward. Now again, one of these push rods is going to be longer than all the rest because it's at that point of its stroke. So, one thing you can do is if you want, you can roll the engine over until they're all basically about the same length, and that does make it easier to install. So that's an option as well. But when I install them, generally one of those push rods is the longest one. I'll make sure to get that one fully seated first and then start tightening down the bolts around it. And then, like I said, do it in stages as you go to really suck the thing down evenly. And then same thing, tighten these bolts down to 16 foot-pounds. And as you can see, as I'm installing this, something that I'm doing is I'm taking one of my fingers here and I'm sliding it underneath the actual rocker, and you can feel if the push rod is fully seated into that rocker cup or not. That's a good preliminary step. Now, it's not our final step, but it's a preliminary to make sure that we're actually getting these things seated correctly. Now, our final step here, and I cannot stress this enough, is that after you have this all bolted down, what you want to do is you want to roll the engine over at least a couple of times and verify that all of your valves are opening and closing as they should. If you do have one of these intake push rods that is not seated correctly and you start rolling it over by hand, chances are it will pop out of there or not engage that valve correctly. So it's one final check to actually verify, make sure everything's correct before you put your cylinder cover on. One more point I wanted to address here. A lot of times I get people messaging me and saying, hey, is it normal for the rocker arms to have some side-to-side play in them after you have them installed? And the answer to that is yes. Now, you'll notice that these ones don't have any side-to-side play, but that's because the camshaft is not on the base circle for that cylinder. This one right back here, the cylinder number 7, this one is on the base circle, so therefore there's no pressure on the valve spring itself. You can see I have side-to-side play. 100% normal for that to happen. These are self-centering, so there's no issue with that. That's not a problem. All right, much progress has been made. You see we have the engine pretty much all the way back together again, but before we actually try to fire this thing up, we have one more thing that we need to address, and again, it is for serviceability. Now, here we have one of my intercooler pipes that I built. This one goes directly from the intercooler up to the intake manifold, and I built it all as one piece because the general consensus is that you want as few amount of couplers as possible. That way you have as few chances for boost leaks, things like that, which makes sense, but I made a mistake when I actually built this pipe. I think it looks decent, but with this pipe in place, it is pretty much impossible to do any top end work on the engine. So this is the first part that has to come out. And unfortunately, to remove this pipe with the way I built it, you actually have to remove the front bumper and it has to come out from underneath the vehicle. So horrible serviceability there. My plan in this instance is I'm basically going to cut this pipe right here in the middle, make it 2 pieces, and install a coupler right there so we can just easily remove the top portion of this pipe and actually work on the top end of this engine. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to be adding another HD coupler here, an HD clamp. Now, if you've never seen these before, these are ingenious devices here that allow a lot of movement within the pipe itself, but you still have a perfect seal, much stronger than any standard silicone coupler ever was. Now, truthfully, this is massive overkill for this situation. I have HD clamps kind of all over this vehicle. They're not really necessary. I'm running 14 PSI on this thing. Silicone couplers would likely be just fine, but I like these things. They're trick and they look cool. And what's really nice is that a lot more companies are starting to make their own versions of these, so the prices have started to come down quite a bit. So these are much more reasonable and actually an option now. Now, this particular one comes from Ace Race Parts. Now, you guys have heard me talk about them before. I really like all their products. I've used a ton of their stuff all over this build. The entire turbo kit, the entire exhaust system, these are all Ace Race stainless parts. This is not sponsored by them. I just happen to like their stuff. So if you guys are interested in something like this, I'll go ahead and put a link in the description down below. All right, with that all being said, let's go ahead and cut this pipe up and get this clamp installed. All right, I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with how that came out. We got the first edge done. Let's go ahead and get this lower portion of the pipe installed, and then we can start fitting up the upper portion and get that welded as well. We'll be done with this project. Well, it's hard to get more simple than that. I basically just cut it to length and then slip the other side of the coupler on there, and it fits up absolutely perfectly, which makes sense. I mean, it was a straight piece of tube before, but still, that's nice when things actually go according to plan like that. let's get it welded up. Now, if you've never seen an HD clamp before and are wondering exactly how it works, so you'll notice that on each end of the coupler here, you have this O-ring, and then there is an inner collar that slips over the end of both of the O-rings. Then there's an outer collar that goes around both of that. What that does is that allows movement inside the collar itself, but this collar can articulate with that and still cover both sides of the O-ring so that there is never actually a loss of connection there. So that's how these HD clamps work. Let's go ahead and get this one installed. Oh, on another note, you'll want to go ahead and lube up these O-rings here before you try to install the collar. If you don't, trying to put this thing on dry is essentially impossible. And also you stand a pretty good chance of actually cutting these O-rings as well. So lube up those O-rings first, we'll slip this collar on. So you can see now that even though there's articulation within this pipe here, this will not have any sort of a boost leak whatsoever, and it has no chance of actually blowing apart because of this collar here, unlike a silicone coupler would. All right, we're getting really close now. The engine has all of the fluids in it. What I need to do is I need to go ahead and build some oil pressure before I start this thing. Now, this would be a really nice time to have that tool from Melling Performance that pre-lubes the whole system before you fire the engine. So with that being said, let's find out who actually won that thing. All right, let's get to the winner of the Melling Oil Pre-Lube tool that I had for the giveaway this time around. I just want to say thank you to everyone who entered. I think you guys were very inventive with all of your suggestions. And the winner this time was chosen completely impartially by my daughter. So if you have a problem with that, take it up with her. But the winner this time around is King Honkler 4036 with this comment: "Man, I sure hope I win this. If I do, I'll be sure to give you my Melling address." So not a bad one there. Good job. Great work. I've contacted you already. Go ahead and email me. If you haven't seen that yet, email me direct, sales@reignitedtx.com. I'll verify it's you, and then I'll get that sent out to you. So congratulations on winning that tool. Okay, because I don't actually have that tool for myself, what I do is I have the fuel pump fuse taken out right now, and I'm just gonna go ahead and crank the engine using the starter until I see oil pressure build here using my scan tool. Again, not the most proficient way to do this, but it is an effective way if you don't have a special tool for pre-lubing the system. Also, as a secondary reason for actually doing this also cranking the engine over allows me to make sure that my belt routing is going to work without the belt trying to walk back and forth. If that looks like it's okay, then we can move on to actually trying to start the vehicle. And the belt routing is immediately not okay. Yeah, that pretty much didn't work at all. So one of my pulleys is not really dead straight or is at an angle, and it's immediately kicking this belt over. Now, for the moment, I took that belt off. I'm gonna deal with that alignment issue here in a little bit, but I do wanna actually crank the engine and build this oil pressure so it is ready to fire when we're ready to go. So let's go ahead and crank this thing. All right, it's a good sign we're already getting some oil pressure here. Yeah, this thing is going to make all the oil pressure. You can tell 65 PSI just while cranking. I think that's going to make quite a bit there. Okay, so that's good news. The engine is pre-oiled. Now let's figure out that belt alignment issue, and then we can start this thing. A few more modifications later, with our bracket assembly for our tensioner and our belt alignment issue is fixed. This thing is running smoothly. The belt is not trying to jump forward or backwards. I figured it was going to take a little bit of finesse to get it perfect once I actually was able to start the vehicle. That's why I didn't paint this thing, and I'm still not going to paint it yet because just in case if there's any other adjustments I need to make, I want to be able to do that and then paint it after I know it's all going to work properly. All right, second to last step, we need to reinstall the fuel pump fuse and actually prime the system and make sure there's no fuel leaks here, and then it is time to start this thing. Now it looks like there's a leak coming from one of my fuel injectors here. The question is it coming from the top O-ring or the bottom O-ring? Oh, and my regulator is leaking as well. How is that happening? Oh, that's full on loose. All right, well, let's make sure to tighten all of those fittings. I don't know why those are loose. All right, you guys, it is finally time to actually fire this thing up. Not gonna lie, I'm pretty nervous right now. I want this to go well. I really want this engine to perform properly. So hoping this thing just fires right up. Now, obviously I have a totally different camshaft in here, so not sure with the settings there if this thing's going to fire up and idle smoothly as it is. I hope it does though. Again, as far as tuning goes, I am still looking for a professional tuning shop to actually tune this thing for me. Finding people to actually take a chance on tuning something like this has been more difficult than I anticipated, but I'm still looking around, still talking to a few different companies about it. We'll see what comes of that. For right now, I should have enough of a baseline tune in this thing to at least let it run and drive around slowly so I can at least move the car around in the meantime. I'm stalling. All right, let's turn the key, see what happens. Well, she fired, but my belt immediately has stretched and is touching itself, and it's gonna eat itself, so. First start postponed yet again. One moment. All right, first start round 3 here. I added a little bit more tension to the belt itself. I went ahead and spaced out that power steering pump just even a little bit more as a temporary solution for right now. Got to figure out what the deal is here. I cannot believe that this belt is stretching that much. There was literally about almost an inch gap between those two pulleys. After running for just a couple of seconds, that narrowed down to where the belt was actually touching itself. So much more stretch than I anticipated on this belt, but we'll see what happens with this scenario right here. Let's try to start this thing. Man, same deal. It immediately kicks all the way forward and bumps the belt off. It's weird. All right, I took the belt completely off for right now. I just want to see if the engine will fire and idle smoothly. It'll just be a good baseline for us. Thinks about it. Now just so you guys know, this eTorque timing belt setup does have a separate belt for the water pump, so the water pump is running this entire time. So we are circulating coolant and everything like that. We're just not running the accessories like the alternator or the power steering pump. Well, I gotta admit, that's a little bit frustrating. I really thought that I had this serpentine belt situation whipped with that new tensioner setup. To have this new issue, definitely a little bit frustrating. Another hurdle that I need to cross. Now, unfortunately, that's going to be it for this episode, but we did start the engine. We know that the engine runs just fine. I just gotta get this last thing handled and hopefully get a professional tuner on board to take care of this thing. Soon enough, we're gonna get this thing out there. We're still in the middle of winter here, so we got some time yet before the tracks open, but I just wanna get this thing moving forward as quickly as I can. I wanna thank you guys for watching as always. We'll see you next time on Reignited.